Welcome to the Pastor's Cut. This is something we started doing after each of the St. Luke's on Broadway sermons. Because I can tell you, as we do our research, we come across so many fascinating things. And sometimes these things are interesting, but they really don't help theologically push the sermon along, help interpret the scripture. And sometimes there really are fascinating things that would be helpful, but they're just in time. And so they have to get cut. So I wanted to share some of these things for those of you who wanted to know a little more behind the scenes of the things that we've learned about the scripture and all about whatever we look at that week. And this week, we've been looking at the story of Shrek. One of the things that I found that was kind of fascinating was it was Brian D'Arcy who played the part of Shrek on Broadway. Now, can you imagine trying to get into character, to look like Shrek? It would take him 1.5 hours every night to be able to get into costume. Multiple people would be working on him for an hour and a half. And finally, when he got through, he would always want at least 30 minutes just to finally sit quiet, alone, and to move into character. It was no easy thing becoming Shrek. On the other hand, you had Sutton Foster, who was going to play Princess Fiona. And so she would come in and she would get into costume to be this beautiful princess. But you remember towards the end of the show, after Shrek kisses her, she has the spell broken and she is transformed. And she's transformed from being this pretty princess into being a beautiful ogre. Well, that has to happen quickly. And so they had it all set up on stage to where for 60 seconds, she would not be the focus, not be on stage, and there were 6 people working on her for 60 seconds in order to transform her from this very pretty princess to suddenly being completely green and being an ogre. 60 seconds. It happened fast every night. It was fascinating. I told you about William Stegg on Sunday morning. I simply had to tell you he was 23 years old when he went to work for the New Yorker, and I carried the story on from there. But he actually has a very fascinating childhood. It really didn't help the sermon to get to where it was going, so it had to be cut for time. But the interesting part of it is his parents, they were Jewish immigrants, and Jewish Polish immigrants from Austria, of all places. They came to New York, and they were socialist. And so his father was a house painter and his mom was a seamstress, and they worked really hard and they always felt oppressed by business. Well, they had several sons, and when these kids were growing up, it's kind of like, what do you encourage them to do? They didn't want them to become workers because then they would be oppressed by the business owners. But they didn't want them to become business owners because then they would oppress the workers. And so what were you supposed to do? Well, they said you can be an artist because being an artist was pure. And so it was that William, when he went to school, began focusing on art. And that's why he focused on art. Parents were socialists, didn't want him to be a worker or an oppressor of the working class. When he graduated high school at 15 years old, he was very smart. And the fascinating thing was he went to college for 2 years and then he dropped out. Went to another art school, went for 3 years, and then he dropped out. Then he went to Yale for 5 days, and he dropped out. He always looked back and said, I had a hard time finishing some of those programs. No, what happened was he was now 23 years old. They were in the midst of the Depression. His 2 older brothers were married and out of the house, having their own families to take care of. His younger brother was 16, still in school. It really fell to William to get out and try to help make some money for the family to survive. And that's why he applied to the New Yorker, got the job at the magazine, would work there almost 50 years. And it was interesting, I told you how he's 61 years old before he wrote his first children's book. And I kept digging into the story. I thought, I'm going to find something really great here, how he had a grandchild who was really struggling with self-esteem. And so he wrote the book Shrek to speak to his grandchild. When he was 83 years old, that's when he wrote the book. But I didn't find that at all. Actually, what I found was that he was 61, and it was nice. He decided he wanted to try something different. There was a friend who told him there's some good money to be made in children's books. And at 61 years old, he still wanted to be creative and learning, and so that's why he started writing children's books. There was no grandchild that he needed to rescue with a wonderful story about Shrek and self-esteem. But he did still write them. He did still learn. He felt you should be growing all your life. In the end, he would produce 25 very successful children's books, and he would not die until he was 95 years old. When they came out with the movie, when they started trying to produce Shrek at DreamWorks, it was also a time they were producing Prince of Egypt. Now, Prince of Egypt had some very strong characters. It was considered the priority at DreamWorks. They knew it was going to go big. It had Val Kilmer, Michelle Pfeiffer, Sandra Bullock, Steve Martin. I mean, this was no small production. They had a budget of $70 million, and when The Prince of Egypt came out, it made $218 million. So about 3 times return on their investment. Fascinating thing was, as they were working on Prince of Egypt, sometimes they felt that their very best artists weren't working hard enough and being creative enough. And if that was the case, then they banned them to go work on Shrek. It's like Shrek was somewhere you had to go if you weren't working hard enough and doing a good enough job. So what happened was it helped Shrek come up with some of the very best artists and creative people they had at DreamWorks. And of course, the budget there was $60 million, less than Prince of Egypt, but it was Shrek that returned on that $60 million, $485 million, just shy of $500 million. It was 8 times return on its money. It was a good thing that those who were the very best were punished and had to go work on Shrek. And finally, yes, Sunday we had a good time with our postlude being I'm a Believer. I'm a Believer. Now, I grew up during the time of the Monkees being on TV, the music group, the Monkees. And they sang I'm a Believer in 1966. It was Mickey Dolenz who sang I'm a Believer. It was a huge hit. Now, I did not know that there was another group called Smash Mouth who wound up recording I'm a Believer in 2001 for the movie Shrek. But the interesting thing is, it was actually Neil Diamond who wrote it. Neil Diamond wrote I'm a Believer, and when he wrote it for Eddie Arnold, the country western singer. That's who he was had in his mind when he's writing I'm a Believer. But Don Kirshner was his music developer, producer, and when he heard the song, he thought, no, I'm not giving it to Eddie Arnold. I'm going to give it to the Monkees. And the Monkees had their TV show, and they played the song. And so there was all these pre-orders for it. It went gold within 2 days of it being released. The fascinating thing is it was Michael Nesmith. He was the guitar player for the Monkees. You may remember him. He was the guitar player, and when he heard the song, he was furious and said, we are not going to sing this song. I am a songwriter, and I know a good song when I hear one, and this is not a good song. It will never go. Don't you hate it when that happens? It's not going to go. Well, Mickey Dolenz recorded it, and in 2 days it went gold. It went on to sell over 10 million hard copies, one of the few singles to ever do that. Before we had digital type music, over 10 million hard copy singles would be sold of I'm a Believer. And so they had it played in the movie by Smash Mouth. Well, when it went to Broadway, what they did, they came to the end of the musical, and after everybody had taken their bows and their curtain calls and the show was over, they started playing I'm a Believer just for kind of fun, for the music for people to be leaving to. So they would be hearing, I'm a Believer as you go out. But what happened was when the people started to hear I'm a Believer, they stopped in their tracks to listen to it. And so the people realized, wait a minute, we don't need to have this at the very end. The writers, the producers of the Broadway musical then put it into the show so that you came to the end, and the final thing that they did was all of the cast is singing I'm a believer. And you think about the words, I thought love was only true in fairy tales, and then for someone else and not for me. It's exactly the message of what was going on with Shrek. But then he saw her face, and now I'm a believer. To be able to realize that you still deserve love, that you can accept yourself, and you are of value to God, you are accepted by God. Go out and live today in that spirit of joy, because it's God really who believes in you. Have a great day.